Good day, friends. I hope everybody is doing well all over our system. Welcome to class, such as it is. Obviously, half the time we're going to be meeting in our regular classroom somewhere in the OSU system. But today, and many other days, we're going to meet here in my office, which is totally not a mess, no matter what it looks like behind you. I can give you a tour of the office. That's John F. Kennedy, in case you're wondering, and you probably were. The Flash seemed to fall over there, so I picked him up. I see Mr. Spock and a fallen Captain America and a Boba Fett over there. So there you go. You've had the tour. If you have questions about other things around you, Doctor Who stuff here and then here, we could talk about that. But we're not here necessarily just talk about how awesome and totally tidy my office is. We are also here to talk about workshops. Now, you may have noticed that I recently posted a call for someone to submit a workshop piece, maybe more than one someone's. And I haven't heard back from anybody as of this recording at this moment, but I certainly hope I'm able to. As I said on that comment that I posted to Canvas, I would love to have somebody or multiple somebodies submit a workshop piece for us. I'm giving it till the end of the week. I think that gives us enough time to go over things over the weekend and then have it all prepared by Wednesday when our class meets the following week in the face-to-face classroom. I think that gives us enough time. But I was thinking maybe part of the reason why people have been apprehensive about getting a hold of me to offer the opportunity to get their work workshopped is one, because it was a holiday yesterday and we're maybe not quite back in the swing of the academic dance, but also because workshops are intimidating. And so what I want to spend time doing today is talking about how we prepare for a workshop, both as the person submitting the work and as the person reading and commenting upon the work. And so I gave you a handout. There's a copy of this. It's got two sides. There's a copy of this that is on Canvas with this video. And basically this is a series of 15 questions. And I say 15 questions, but it's ultimately far more than 15 because I have multiple questions within each point. And each one of them is taking on a different issue that I think is important for us to look at when we're workshopping a piece. It is intimidating to workshop a piece. It's intimidating to be workshopped, but it's intimidating to workshop one too. Because sometimes we wonder, who am I to provide feedback for this? Maybe I am somebody who doesn't have a ton of confidence when it comes to writing fiction, and I am reading the work of somebody who's done it a lot more than I have. And I am trying to figure out what is it that I can say that's going to help this person improve their work. What is it that I'm going to do? And as we talked about in class last week, I want us to read everything thoroughly. I didn't say this, but it probably makes sense to read each piece more than once. You don't have to go crazy with that. But if you read it once and then at the very least have sections that you've marked that you know are especially relevant to the piece, I think that's the least you can do. Sometimes it's hard to go through something the first time and feel like you've totally mastered it. So I think it's respectful and maybe necessary to go through a piece more than one time. I think also it is useful to really mark it up and to think about it. It's also important to know that, let's say you have an opinion on something to do with a piece, but you're not sure that it's right. You're like, I kind of like this description of this thing, but I don't know. There's no law that says that whatever you suggest to this writer is something that absolutely has to happen. There's not. I know when I first started taking workshops, I kind of thought there was. I mean, not a literal law. I knew that. But one of the things that I did when I first got a piece workshop is I was so excited. I thought, actually, the first time I got a piece workshop, I thought everybody would love it. I had this vision in my head that the students would have nothing critical to say. They would pick me up on their shoulders at the end of class, cheer my name, and carry me out of the room. That did not happen the first time that I had a story workshopped in a fiction class. Or anything workshopped in a fiction class, or any other class for that matter. What they did is they gave me good feedback. And no, they didn't throw a party in my honor because it was the best workshop story that had ever been done. But what they did is help me. And so I realized that that's what I wanted. What would be the point of writing a perfect workshop story? There'd be none. Can you imagine if we had a workshop story that was so flawless that nobody had anything to add to how to help it? Would be a complete waste of everybody's time. No, instead what we need are workshop pieces that bear scrutiny and bear conversation and deserve conversation about how to make them better. And that's what we're looking for. But there was one workshop that I thought, you know what, I'm in this class with these brilliant people. I knew enough of that at that point. These are brilliant people that have great ideas. What I want to do is listen to everybody and do everything I can. So I tried at one point to listen to everybody. So I got comments back. I wrote down everything feverishly when I was listening to their feedback and workshop. I got notes back from everybody, and I wanted to do everything that everybody said because they were all brilliant, and this would make my story awesome. The problem with that is that people contradicted themselves. One person said they loved the first paragraph on page 3, and another person said the first paragraph on page 3 isn't very good. And so I was left uncertain of how to proceed with anything. Trust yourself and trust certain people in the class. It's okay. We'll talk more about this as we start doing our workshopping. But if you are somebody who is debating whether or not you want to be the first to get workshop, it's a great opportunity. It really is. It's exciting. You'll get started right away. You might have an opportunity to do it again, time permitting, before the semester goes on. And I really think you should. So if you're kind of on the fence, let me know. I know just based on your introductory comments, some of you are apprehensive about the class. Some of you haven't done a ton of writing in fiction or creatively at all. Leave. I understand if you want to leave this opportunity to workshop first to somebody who's done it more often. That's fine. But I do want to strongly encourage somebody who's kind of on the fence to just do it. It'll help the class, and it'll help you. It'll be a fun way of getting us started. But what I wanted to give you today, the main bullet, was this sheet of questions to consider while examining fiction. I'm going to read it, and while I'm reading it, I'm going to kind of discuss some of the points that are on here. And I want to make sure that you know that you can always add a conversation point below. So after this is posted, after you're watching it, as you're watching it, post a comment or a question, and I will get there, and we'll have a conversation that way. If you have a question about something that's here, I'll make sure I respond. Others should also make sure that they respond so that everybody is in on the conversation, and we can have great discussions this way. So question 1, how do the title and introduction of this piece function? Do both or either grab the reader? Why or why not? So the way I like to think of the title and the first sentence is sort of an argument, for lack of a better term, that you're making to the reader. You're making this argument that, hey, this is something that deserves to be read further. The title is something that is engaging enough to make me want to read further. The opening sentence is something that's like, oh, this is a pretty good opening sentence. I mean, by that rationale, I guess the second sentence is an argument that you've added in case the first sentence argument worked. But I want you to think of things that make for compelling and engaging openings. It isn't about overthinking what a title should be. Sometimes a title can be quite effective in simplicity and directness. But I think it's important for us to make sure of a couple things, that they function well to draw the reader in, and they function well to explain what's happening. If you have a title or an opening sentence that is kind of cool, but has nothing to do with what happens later, it's not really a great title. Think about titles that you like. What's a title that you like? Is it something that is direct? Is it something that's kind of weird? Is it something that isn't fully understood until the end? Sometimes there are cool ways of playing with titles. And we'll talk about this more. We'll talk about all these points more as the semester goes on. But the main purpose of a title for the stage we're discussing now is to draw me in. Make sure that I have a reason to keep reading. 2, how is the piece structured? Is it jumping around in time? Are there short scenes that move quickly? Is everything happening in one location? Sharing, the story that we read, kind of has one location that we're working with throughout, although the narrator has some internal digressions that move the piece around. Emergency, a story that we've read by Dennis Johnson, that we read this week in the Method and Madness, is one that does move around in location a little bit. When we're talking about stories that jump around in time, you know what I mean, right? Maybe it happens because we are dealing with a narrator who is thinking about things moving differently, like in Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. Or maybe we're working with a narrator who literally is kind of jumping around temporally. I want you to think about this as you're reading the story because I think it's a good way of understanding the way the piece is functioning. And you can ask, does this seem to be the best strategy for this particular piece of writing? Would sharing as a story have been better if we would have had actual flashbacks to almost meetings between the narrator and the man that comes and asks for mayonnaise? Would that have made for a better story? I don't know. No, probably. But think about the way the piece that you're reading for workshop is doing it. And this is how we help, is we start to think about things in a deeper way. Often when we go to the movies or we read a story, we might think, I like it, I didn't like it, but we don't start to think about why as much as we need to. These series of questions are going to help you get deeper into why. And that's what we need to do. 3, does this piece contain enough conflict to keep it interesting? Conflict, we know what that is, right? That's some sort of tension that is existing at the heart of a story that compels us to want to go forward. It could be a conflict between two characters. It could be a conflict between one character and something that is existing out in the world or internally. My wife used to ask me a lot for recommendations for books, and then she stopped asking me for them, in part because she said that a lot of the books that I would recommend to her were all about experimental fiction that didn't ultimately have any conflict or character development beyond just strange, angry people. And so she wanted that conflict to keep it interesting. I think most stories are going to have some kind of conflict that makes it work. Doesn't contain too much. There might be situations in which there are just too many things. One term we're going to use in this class is plot ball. This was taught to me by one of my old professors. And the idea of a plot ball is that when you have a plot ball and you throw it in the air, there's a plot ball that's up there. Don't look for it. It's still up in the air. It's a plot element. It's a story element that we've introduced. And eventually, it'll come down by the end of the story, if the story works properly. That will have a plot ball that will exist in the air, and then by the end of an effective story, we'll catch it, and everything will be fine. We usually have more than one plot ball that'll be in the air, right? You'll have one over here, and one over here, and one over here. And they'll stay up there, and they might come down at various points during the story, but you have to catch them all. You have to make sure that every plot element that you've introduced, every story element, every conflict that you've introduced is given at least some modicum of resolution. And what happens, I think, too often is that we end up with so many plot balls up in the air that we lose track of them. Maybe we have so many conflicts, we have so many different things. We have man versus man, and man versus nature, and man versus self, and I'm using man in the outdated sense, and I get that, I'm sorry. But all of those things are interesting, but if we have too many, we lose track of our plot balls, and then they start coming down, and we can't keep track of them. So think about whether or not a story has too much conflict. And obviously, when you're thinking about your own stories, ask these questions too. These are valuable questions. Break down what examples of conflict you see in the piece, and consider how each is functioning. So when you find conflict in the story, figure out how it's working, and if it's as effective as it can be. Number 4, this is important. What does each character want? Every character in a story should want something, whether it's your main character or if it's a very, very tangential supporting character. Everybody needs to want something, and you as the writer need to know what that thing is. You might not even fully get it across to us as the reader, but there has to be a reason for each person's existence, rather than just being a plot device. William Faulkner did this to the extreme. He would write out massive backstories for every character who appeared, whether it was one of the main characters of the story or if it was somebody who's just walking past somebody else on the street. He had massive understandings of how they fit into the world that he's created. I'm not necessarily saying we do that. But what I am saying is that you need to know who your characters are. And this begins by what they want. What do they want? Do they want to be safe? Do they want a cookie? Do they want peace and justice in the world? Do they want to get the lost Ark of the Covenant? What is it that they want? Once you know that, you have a better understanding of who your character is. And is the desire that's driving the main character tangible and relatable enough to engage readers? If what the character wants is to bring peace and love and understanding to the world, how is the character trying to do that? And do I buy it? Is it, as the question asks, tangible and relatable enough? Because sometimes we end up with wants and desires that I don't grasp as a reader. And you need to make sure that you get those across as clearly as you can. 5, do the characters behave in ways that you believe? This is important, right? What are the characters doing, and do I buy it? There's nothing worse than reading a book and having a character that you think you know do something that that character wouldn't do. And sometimes the story can explain it and they can justify it. Sometimes they don't. This can happen with super well established characters, or this can happen with characters that I'm just meeting. If there's a character who's just not behaving in a logical way, it's going to be very hard for me to get invested in this character at all. So think about how characters behave, and this works in any type of fiction, whether it's literary fiction, or it's experimental fiction, or it's genre fiction. Characters are characters. And so whether I am somebody who lives in, whether I'm a factory worker in Pennsylvania, or I am an alien creature somewhere, or I am the heir to a mighty sword somewhere in a fantasy realm, everybody has to act in ways that matter. And that feel real. So do your characters behave in ways, or do these characters behave in ways that you believe as a reader? And are there any characters that behave in a way that seems implausible? Even if this is a major character or a secondary character, it's important to find out how we can deal with this. If there's a character who's just doing something that's like, I don't know why that character would ever do this except to further the plot. And if characters are only existing to serve a plot and not serve themselves and act in a logical way, we got to change it. We got to do something about that. Do the characters seem round or flat? You know what this means, right? A round character is Hamlet, a character that undergoes change, a character that is different from the beginning to the end, a character who lets the world kind of influence the decisions that he or she makes. That is a round character, a character of depth and change. A flat character is a character that doesn't undergo change. This is usually a supporting character. This is not to say that a flat character has to be boring and entirely one-dimensional. It just means they don't change. It just means that this isn't their story. It means that the things that will drive them are not going to be as obvious to us as what we have. You should still have your flat characters have something that they need to do, but they're just not going to have the levels of complexity, and they're not going to undergo change in the way that maybe your narrator, or not narrator, but your main character is. And let's talk more about change. Number 6, are the characters that need to be dynamic in this piece indeed dynamic? Are the characters who need to change going to change? Not every character in the story needs to do this. But generally, the main characters in a piece change over the course of the story. Does this happen? And if your character doesn't change, if your character confronts the opportunity for change and then says, not today, I don't want to change, talk about that too. Why does the character refuse the opportunity to change? Because that can be compelling and important too. But think about how your characters are evolving over the course of the story, and think about how it's working in service of the story that you're writing. 7, this is simple, right? What is this piece about? What's going on? Can you tell? Do you have an understanding, if you read it, of what's happening? Is it compelling? Is the plot clear and understandable? Do I know what's going on? This is simple, but it's important, right? Very often when you're watching a bad movie, there are two things that can happen, I think, often in a really, really bad movie. Either the plot is so simple it is boring beyond anything, or it's so convoluted and complicated that you can't figure anything out. Don't go toward the convoluted and complicated area either. Try to create a plot that is clear and understandable. And if it is complicated, things can be complicated. But if it is complicated, make sure that you're giving the reader enough to really move from one complicated plot point to the next. Is the plot believable? Do I buy what's going on? Now, even if this is genre fiction, I can still have a believable plot. Even if it is tinged with magical overtones, I can still absolutely believe it. Because I can believe the characters, I can believe the motivations, I can believe the integrity of the world that has been created. So this isn't about magical elements. This is about, do I believe in the validity and the plausibility of whatever these characters are trying to do within the world of the plot that's being constructed. And obviously, over the semester, we're going to talk a lot about plot and story and things like that. 8, are there subplots that exist in addition to the main plot? So a subplot would be a secondary plot that is somewhere in the story or the novel that helps us understand better what happens in the main plot. To get full Shakespearean on you here, a very famous subplot would be the Gloucester subplot in King Lear. I know, I went to King Lear. I'm sorry. So in the main plot of King Lear, Lear is dealing with the betrayal of his daughters, and in the secondary plot, Gloucester is dealing with the betrayal of one of his sons. And so the story there are the stories there parallel one another. Obviously, the Lear piece of the story is the main event. That's the thing that matters. That's the important one. But watching what Gloucester's going through is giving us a greater understanding of Lear's story. That's a subplot. Typically, subplots are going to connect to the main plots of a piece. We want everything to feel connected, so you don't want to have a subplot that feels like it's just existing on its own. We do that sometimes in sitcoms and TV comedies. We're more apt to be okay with subplots that seem to just exist with two characters from The Office doing their own thing while another thing is happening elsewhere. Don't do that as often with this. We want everything to feel coherent and connected. Are these subplots complementary to the plot, or do they get in the way? Sometimes you might try to do something with a subplot that doesn't quite work. You're not able to give it as much time. If there weren't any subplots, should there have been? Typically, in a short story, we wouldn't have a ton of subplots because we have minimal time to deal with our main plot. So you might not face subplots in a shorter story. If you're working on a novel, you probably do have some. That's fine. 9. Does this piece start and end at the right point in the potential narrative? Why or why not? We talked about this a little bit in class last Wednesday. You have the choice to begin your story and to end your story anywhere you want. What power you have, friends. Begin and end anywhere you want. So what you need to think about with the piece that you're writing is it ending and beginning at the right spot? If is the beginning too on the nose? Are you beginning with so-and-so woke up and looked at the clock and realized that they were late for school? Is that where you want to begin? Works great in Back to the Future. Is that what we want to do in our story? Or do you want to begin maybe a little bit later, a little bit earlier, and see if there are other ways of grabbing our reader? Maybe that feels a little familiar, and so we don't necessarily feel as connected to it. Or do you want to, is the ending in the right place? Are you rushing the ending? Are you spending too much time hitting the ending? Think about this. Our stories don't have to begin in a literal, here's where it starts, here's where it ends. Plot-wise, this is what dictates it. It might be interesting character-wise to play around with a few other things and see what you can do. 10. Does this piece do enough to create a sense of place? Do we know where we are? And is it something that the characters are interacting with? Does the setting feel like a character? It really ought to. If the setting feels like it's barely there, like the reader is not sure where we are, if the writer isn't really spending any time with it, then it's a problem. If we just say that, hey, we're at a park, and then the characters are at a park and they talk to each other, and I have no sense of park at all, that's a problem. We want to make sure that we feel like we are at that park, whatever it is. And that means that there are going to be trees, and there are going to be benches, and there are going to be swing sets. But what kind of swing set? What kind of surface does the playground have? Is it sand? Is it wood chips? How well kept are things? Is the grass looking neglected? You know what I'm saying? When you're creating a setting, ask yourself what it looks like. Know what it looks like. Your reader's not going to know that. There's so many different things that the word park, for instance, can elicit that I can't just rely on my reader to get it right, especially if there's something very specific that I need them to know. So in what ways could the setting have been more used? Make sure the characters are interacting with the setting. Don't let them just sit in the middle of a setting. Make them interact with it. Don't just sit near a park and a playground. Don't just sit near a playground. Pick up the sand and feel it. Let the characters feel it through their fingers and let them think about the things that are going on in their lives. Let the setting elucidate us on who these characters are, and let the characters elucidate us on what the setting means. This is important. What ways did the characters interact with the setting? Are the characters really interacting properly with it, or do they not even seem to know it's there? You don't want to overdo it, as with anything, but you want to do it, at least a little bit. 11. How extensive is description used in the piece? Was it insufficient, too excessive? Perhaps it fluctuated between the two at various points. In what way could the author use description to his or her advantage? Are we describing everything in such extensive detail that the reader gets bored? That happens, right? I'm not going to diss Charles Dickens. I'm not here to do that. But by the time we get to the fifth page of a description of someone's left earlobe, I'm getting pulled out a little bit. It's not always the case in Dickens, but he was getting paid by the word. It makes sense. We are not getting paid by the word. We're not getting paid by anything. So we don't have to linger on that left earlobe quite as much as Dickens felt that he did. That being said, you've got to get some description in. You have to help us understand who these characters are. But be careful, especially when it comes to describing characters, of dumping everything at the beginning of a section about a character description. Avoid this urge to give me like, here are 2 paragraphs describing this character. Here's everything about her. And then, now she's walking into a room. And then I have to keep referring back because I know you've told me things about this character, but I didn't see it in action. I didn't see it actually illustrated. So I'm not actively seeing her as the descriptions that you've given me. And that becomes a problem. So unfold a description of a character or a setting or a place or a thing over time so that I get a better understanding of it as I go through it. It's never a great feeling when you have to feel like, oh gosh, there's a character whose name was mentioned 3 pages ago very briefly. I don't remember her. Now I have to go backtrack my way to figure it out. Try to minimize that as much as we can, and the best way to do that is to unfold our characters and their descriptions. But that goes for just description in general. Just make sure that I know what's happening, that I see things effectively, but probably avoid over description. It's finding that sweet spot. And sometimes the best descriptions that we can give are surprising and interesting. Maybe sometimes that's with metaphor. Maybe sometimes that's just pointing out some weird aspect of a thing or a character. But oftentimes saying one quirky and memorable thing about a descriptor for something is more effective than spending 2 paragraphs describing the texture. You know what I mean? Very often the characters that I'm most apt to remember, especially secondary characters in a book or a story, are those that are kind of described briefly but memorably. So do your best to get that across. 12, dialogue. How is dialogue working in this piece? Did the character speak in a way that felt natural? Was dialogue used to develop characters, or did it just further plot? Explain in more detail. Dialogue is really important. Dialogue is a way of helping us get to know characters more, because we get to know what they're thinking, how they operate, how they speak. That's important. Try to create dialogue that develops character and develops story, but doesn't just develop story. Don't have conversations between characters where all they're doing is talking plot. Make sure that the characters speak in a way that is honest to the way people speak, but not all the way. I remember once, several years ago, there was a friend of mine, girl that I went out with for a while, and she talked to me later and she said, oh, I just saw this movie that so reminded me of you and you have to watch this movie. I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. Thinking of an old girlfriend thinking of me, I wonder what this movie is. So I went and I found this movie. And this movie was part of I think Mumblecore is what they called it. It was part of a movement many years ago, like 10 years ago, maybe more, to create characters who spoke and acted as people actually do in normal circumstances. So instead of this highly polished and well-spoken and everybody always coming up with the right word at the right moment, these were characters who stumbled and mumbled their way through things. So there was a lot of and ahs and uhs. And so I watched the movie, resented the old girlfriend, was kind of mad that she thought of me for this. But it was also beyond the fact that I was, vaguely insulted. Not really, though. You got to recognize who you are. But what really got me is that the movie was terrible because I didn't want to be in this world. I didn't want to be in a world where people really were literally, even if it happens, I don't want to watch that on the screen. So be careful with that on the page too. Minimize the real world vocalizations that certainly happen, but slow us down when we're working through a story. Minimize people saying each other's names. We don't do it all the time in the real world. We do sometimes. We do it when we need to get someone's attention for whatever reason. We don't do it at the end of every line that we speak. Characters sometimes in stories have a tendency to do that. Help characters build their personalities through the things they say. And when you are creating dialogue, and again, we're going to talk about all this stuff later in more detail, but I want to give you good stuff now too. One thing that's valuable when you're recording or when you're making dialogue is don't overthink dialogue tags. For one, sometimes she said, he said is perfectly great. He cried. She exclaimed. They call a lot of attention to themselves and they seem silly after a while. Also, people don't just talk. Often they use their hands a lot. I'm going to hide them now because they see that I'm doing that totally. But no, people use their hands a lot. Describe that. Sometimes people fidget with a thing that they find, especially when maybe they're awkward and uncomfortable in a conversation, or if they're just fidgety, which some of us are, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some people have a tendency, I've heard, to touch their hair frequently. I have no understanding of that, but some people I hear do that. Your characters can do this stuff too, right? Your characters can nervously touch their hair, or they can non-nervously touch their hair. They just do it. That's fine. Give your characters quirks. Give your characters physicality. It's so much more interesting to read dialogue when you're also reading actions. When you're reading the way the characters are kind of responding to each other and their environment as they're talking to one another. All this stuff can happen together. 13. What is the point of view of the story? Is it first? Is it third? We talked about this a little bit, right? And we'll talk about it more as the weeks go on. First person is I did this, I did that. Third person is she did this, she did that. There are different sliding scales of the third person especially. Sometimes we're up close and we know everything that's going on in that character's mind, and sometimes we're pulled way back and we know everything that's going on in everybody's mind. What's the right narrator telling the story? Do we have a narrator who is so deeply involved in the action that it gives us a different view of what is happening within the story? The Great Gatsby is narrated by Nick Carraway. It's not narrated by Gatsby. Makes sense, right? When you think about the story, if you've read it. Nick is able to have enough distance, though he's still deeply involved with what's going on, to have an ability to be somewhat objective even when he's not fully. If it was Gatsby, well, we might lose the story toward the end because we wouldn't have a narrator anymore. I would never be able to trust him. I essentially trust Nick for the most part. There are several stories that do that are narrated by a first-person narrator who isn't the central figure in the action, but a certainly important one. The novel Sophie's Choice by William Styron does the same thing. And so it's important to kind of think about what's happening and if there would be other options. Sometimes we just do it and we don't think about it. We just like, hey, here's a device and it's third person and that's just what it is, or it's first person and that's just what it is. And you don't think about what that allows you to do or what that limits. And sometimes narrators can kind of work around it. We might have some stories that have, like a novel series that would have one narrator who is telling us the entire story, and then a later book might have that narrator again, but also a different narrator in a different section to kind of give us another perspective. And that could happen throughout. I think Twilight does that. See, look, I can recognize Twilight. That's fine. And this is okay, but you just need to be aware of what you're doing as the writer, and as the reader of somebody else's work, you need to be aware of what they're doing too. What would happen if the storytelling in the piece shifted? If a first-person narration turned into an omniscient third? We are not talking about the elusive second, but I can mention it. Second is you. That's when a story is written in the you point of view. Less common. Certainly happens, especially happens in Choose Your Own Adventure books. Remember those? Those would be stories that were written in the second person, and it was a kids series that would give you choices at the bottom of each page, like if you want to go in the left door, turn to this page. If you want to go to the right door, turn to this page. And we're probably not writing Choose Your Own Adventure stories, so it's probably not essential here. 14. I'm flipping the page. You're probably just scrolling down further. Did the piece conclude in a satisfactory way? Did the resolution seem natural, or did too much happen at once and ultimately seem convenient? If the piece left a lot of loose ends, was that okay? Did it still feel like enough of an ending? before I get into this, I'm gonna establish this. And this is the first time that I've established this rule, and it's not really a rule, so don't worry much. While being on camera and not being in the direct path of my students will get mad at me when I say it. The rule is try not to kill characters in your stories. I'm allowing dramatic pause for you to be mad at me about this. What I'm saying here is that too often we rely on killing characters or doing these big dramatic gestures to get in the way of a satisfactory conclusion or something that is emotionally compelling. We kind of fall into this idea that's like, I need the big gesture to close it out. It makes sense. Most media, especially movies, have multiple deaths along the way. So I want you to minimize the amount of times we kill characters. If you have to kill a character in a story, if it is integral to what you're doing, don't worry about this. This is something I want you to be thoughtful about, not necessarily something that's going to compromise every single thing you do. I don't want you to resent me for this. But I think that too often, students don't quite know how to end stories, especially young writers. And they end up deciding that the best way to end the story is to kill off everybody. Many years ago, I had a short story in a class that I was teaching a workshop. And the story was about a high school student who was drunk driving, and he was driving with his best friend and his girlfriend, and they got in a terrible car crash. And the best friend who was in the car died, and the boyfriend and the girlfriend were taken to the hospital. And the boyfriend is riddled with guilt because of what he's done. And I believe in the story, and it's long since gone in the story, so who knows? I think I'm right. I think the guy who crashed the car because he was drunk driving first thing in the morning, he thinks that not only his best friend is dead, but also his girlfriend. So he's riddled with guilt, and he decides that he's going to kill himself. And so he goes to the top of the hospital, which I think generally is a hard place to access. But in this story, he went to the roof of the hospital in order to kill himself and jump off the roof. And then the girlfriend is not dead, and so she goes to the top of the hospital because she figured out that he was there. And she is trying to tell him, no, don't do it. But it's too late, and he jumps off the hospital roof and kills himself, and then she jumps off too to potentially save him. And so by the end of this 8-page story, there's this massive body count that didn't even make logical sense. And so we had to discuss that. Don't do that. Don't do it. If you feel like the only thing that can happen is the character dying, then so be it. But if there are ways to do different things, try that too. But overall, this idea of a piece concluding in a satisfactory way, that can mean different things to different people. Maybe for some of us, we want conclusion. Maybe some stories push back at that. Maybe I really don't want something that is just such a natural resolution that it feels too convenient. Sometimes that annoys me. If we end up with oh, now everybody's happy, even though people were not happy 2 pages ago. Now everything's great. Try to find ways that fit the integrity of the story. And if the piece does leave a lot of loose ends at the end, sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's really not. And so you can help this writer figure out what the best path is on that. The last one, number 15, is a reasonable question. Did you like this piece? Why or why not? Don't ever tell a writer in workshop, I really didn't like your piece. Don't ever say that. Talk about places to improve it. If you didn't like the piece, try to figure out why and figure out how that can help the writer. We're not here for our own egos. We're not here to talk about what we like or what we don't like. We're here to talk about what we like and what we don't like only insofar as how it can help my writer get to a better place. And so if you really like the piece, that's awesome. Tell me why you liked it. That's a valuable thing for the reader to learn. But what would you suggest in general terms to make it better? And obviously, what would you suggest in specific terms to make it better? And this whole list is specific terms in which this thing could be made better. And the more we can really put forth those suggestions and that information to our reader, the better we are. So go through this list. Have it close by when you're workshopping your first story or stories. Maybe it's not a bad idea to keep in mind when you're working on your story, because it might have things in it that will help you improve the work that you're doing. so keep track of this. I think it's a valuable thing. And now we'll get back to where I started, which is please send me a workshop story. The next time we're in class, I would love to get going on workshopping as soon as we can. I think it's going to be to the betterment of our class. We only have so many times in which we'll be meeting. I'm already kind of factoring in a lot of other discussion stuff that we'll do in class next time. So if we don't have multiple workshop stories, that's probably okay. But I want to get at least one so we can practice our skills. And so please, if you're thinking about this, and if there's any way I can talk you into it, email me, and I will do my best to talk you into it. Hopefully I'll have another conversation up here. Now, this feels silly to call this a lecture, but I guess it is. I want to feel more informal and casual and conversational than that. But I want to do one where we talk a little bit about the text that we read too. So what I might do is post a short video on that, and then open it up for discussions between us. But I don't want to overwhelm us every day with too much. So today I've given you this. As I said before, post questions on our Canvas discussion thread. So right below, ask anything about the stuff that we've got. Come up with suggestions and ideas. Anything that you think feels relevant to this discussion, go ahead and post it. And yeah, somebody send me a story. I would love that. Unless we have anything else to discuss, and I guess I'm the only one discussing, so that has to be on me. Let's call this a day. And again, be in touch. If you have any questions for me and you have any short stories that you want to send me, please do. All right, everybody, thank you and have a great day. And I will talk to you very soon on Canvas and then a little bit later in person. Thanks.